So, RA21, what is it? Well, RA21 stands for Resource Access for the 21st Century, and it's a joint initiative of STM, which is the International Association of STM Publishers, and I think we have AFCA here in the back, so AFCA is representing STM, and the National Information Standards Organisation, and we have Todd at the front representing NISO. And it's aimed at optimising access protocols across key stakeholder groups. So all the groups that are involved in scholarly communications. So we have the subscribers, libraries, and the vendors, identity federation operators, and the publishers. They're all involved in RA21. And the aim is to facilitate seamless user experience that goes beyond the current access mechanisms that are supported by IP. And the user is at the centre of this, and we'll find out more about how we're trying to improve things for the user as we go through this morning. So the goals of RA21 is to recommend new solutions, as I said, that go beyond IP recognition. And we have it's a multi-stakeholder project. We have representatives from all the stakeholder groups. In total, we have over 60 organisations actively participating in the project at this time. And you'll hear what's coming out of the project as we go through this morning. We've been testing and improving solutions by organising pilots, and you'll see some aspects of that from some of the talks today. We've got corporate pilot, we've got one corporate pilot and 2 academic pilots. And the aim is to establish best practices. We'll be using the NISO recommended practice process to pull the outcomes from the RA21 project into practical recommendations and guidelines. But more recently, we've realised that instead of having a project that then just finishes and having nice guidelines, we actually now have to start to prepare to support adoption after the end of the project. We need now to identify potential parties to operate any centralised infrastructure that is required for adoption and implementation at a later stage. So I mentioned that we have 3 different pilots. So we have the corporate pilot, which involves a number of organisations in the pharma industry, and they have some specific needs. And then we have 2 academic pilots, the technical pilots, that are exploring different implementation approaches. One is browser-based and the other is cloud-based solution. But cutting across the pilots, we have 2 key work areas, work groups, and you will hear about those work streams this morning. So we have the user experience, which is essential, it's at the core of the project, and we have privacy and security, because we have to protect user privacy, but make sure that the systems that everyone's using are secure as well. And with that, I'll pass over to Rich Wegner from MIT, who's going to talk about the academic library perspective.
Thank you. My name is Rich Wenger. I am the e-resource systems manager at the MIT library, have been for close to 14 years, I suppose. In some of the publicity, you may have seen my presentation described as the academic library perspective. And indeed, it will be a perspective from my experience in the academic library space, but I hasten to add that I do not speak, of course, for all academic libraries. So if you are hearing this presentation and you have interest and thoughts about this entire topic, please make your interest known to RA21 and to others, and your ideas and your disagreements and your recommendations and so forth. The library community is kind of by nature somewhat laid back. Things tend to happen to us rather than our making them happen. Try to step forward out of that role in this case. We need leadership here, and I invite your ideas. More about that in a bit. As I say, I've been managing e-resources. I should say that my title, e-resource systems manager, means that I manage systems, not people, but I deal with a very large group of library staff. The systems I manage are proxy server, SFX, our link resolver, to some extent, actually those 2 and many connections from those 2 systems out to other systems are ILS and many others. So I'm involved there in several roles, and I do a lot of troubleshooting. People can't get to this resource or that for what reason, and there are often many. So I've been in this space for a while. Here's what I plan to cover. And I won't read this to you. I'm going to move on, but I should say at the outset that some of the topics that I'm going to cover overlap to some degree with the succeeding presentations here today. So I'm not treating anything here exhaustively. There's more detail to come on any number of these things. Please keep that in mind. This is more of a survey of the entire problem than it is a specific drilling down on any one. In the beginning, IP filtering is obsolete, is what the title said, and I believe that heart and soul, and I hope to convince you of that too, if you're not already. Here are some of the problems that we'll get into. The march of technology, playing games, and so forth. So I'm going to back up and take those a little bit more slowly. IP filtering, and I will be explicit in case you're somewhat new to this space or to this problem. IP filtering, by that I mean the deeply ingrained convention now in academic libraries whereby licensed content is made available to legitimate users because of and on the basis of those users' IP address. That is to say, the providers keep on file some range of IP addresses that is specific to your institution or mine. And when they see a connection, when the provider sees connections from any one of those IP addresses in those ranges, they accept that connection anonymously and unauthenticated. Please make note of those two things. Anonymous, unauthenticated access has become the de facto standard and has been for many, many years. Back in the early days of the internet, this probably made sense. Excuse me. If you think back to the late 90s, IP addresses had meanings that they no longer have. I'm going to use MIT as an example, and I should say that if I refer to Net18, that's just a shorthand for saying MIT's authorized IP ranges. Our IPs tend to start with 18 something, and so Net18 is just an example of my network. Back in the late 90s, if I or a user on a Net18 address navigated to a provider site who's providing licensed content to which we subscribe, that IP address meant something really pretty specific. That IP address in our case meant not just Net18 or an 18 dot something kind of sort of in the cloud or in some virtual space or something like that. It meant that's coming from a workstation that is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Better than that, it's on a piece of land, big triangle, right along the Charles River. It spans Mass Ave. And better than that, that IP address can be mapped to a specific building, to a specific office, and to a specific desk, or whatever it's on. And that device is almost certainly going to be a desktop computer that does not move. It stays there. That's what it meant back then. It doesn't mean anything of the kind anymore. Once in a while it happens to correspond, but keep in mind that's where it started. There were no portable devices. We all walk around now with more computing power in our pocket than the Apollo moonlander had. Multi-gigabyte databases on our phones, and on and on and on. None of that was there. Computers were not being carried around. People were not dialing in from home, at least not in the early days, and so on. So that's what I mean when I talk about the early days of the internet and the march of technology. IP addresses were static. You got assigned one and it stayed that way. That is almost universally not true today. While it is possible in any of your locations to assign static IP addresses, your IT people could do that, almost every user is renting an IP address for the hour, for the day. Next week it'll be something different, and nobody knows if that's going on. This model that I just described, where an IP address means a very specific physical, geographical place, carries some unspoken assumptions with it that we need to examine. I've already mentioned this, the march of technology. I'm not going to step through this. You all know about this, but just in the past dozen years, the technological landscape is just astonishingly different than it was, certainly from the late 90s. Playing games, what do I mean by that? So we've got a model in place, and the model says, for MIT users, got to have a Net18 address or I'm just not going to talk to you. That's from the presenter's point of view. In the meantime, with the technology moving on, we've now got users connecting from off campus. And it's not just off campus, meaning down the street. It means down the hall, down the street, another state. It means around the world. It could be any time zone. It could be anywhere in the world, connecting legitimately. These are MIT students and traveling faculty and all the rest, legitimately connecting to our system and needing to get to our subscribed resources. And you can bet that if you're in a hotel room in Singapore, your IP address is not on Net 18. But we've got a model that says, Net 18, if you're MIT, I can't talk to you unless you're Net 18. So what do we? I'm going to put this somewhat provocatively. My favorite way of describing this is that we have, meaning the large community of libraries, we have invested an astonishing amount of time and staff and money and so forth, and continue to do so in systems of intentional deception. Now, I've had people kick back about that, and let me assure you, I do not mean that to imply by that there's some nefarious intent, not at all. But a proxy server is exactly that. We have an access model that says Net 18, I can't talk to you. So we put a proxy server in place for our users to connect to. And what we're saying by that is basically this. You want Net 18? All right, I'll give you Net 18. So remember that assumption with IP filtering that those Net 18 addresses pointed to a specific geographical and physical location? That just went out the window with proxy server. Does no such thing. No such thing. But that enabled us to pretend that the march of technology wasn't happening. Nothing needed to change on the access side. We'll jigger around with people's addresses up front, and we'll play some puppet games with proxy servers, and all is well. Cool. VPNs do the same thing. They essentially do the same thing, and of course they're widely used. We use them too. They do the same thing. They get people onto our network so that when they go to your provider or the other, they're on Net 18, all is well. Here's the bottom line from my point of view. The assumption that an IP address equates to a physical location, and that equates to an authenticated, authorized user is just simply false. Once in a while it's true, but the idea that that's largely true and can be depended upon is just flat wrong, and has been for many, many years. One of those hidden assumptions that I alluded to a little while ago about the IP filtering model simply is that because we know by the IP, we being the model, because we know the IP address, we think we know where that workstation is, and because we know that, in MIT's case, we know for certain that MIT would not have allowed any unauthorized person to be near that workstation and use it. So we're good to go. I mean, I don't think I have to convince you how that is. It just is not the case. Not because anybody's trying to actively trying to subvert it. It just does not describe the world we live in. To push that point just a bit further, IP filtering is about, first and foremost, where a user is, and we've already agreed, I hope, that we don't have the foggiest idea where a user is by their IP address, but the model says, I need to know where a user is by their IP address, and then everything else falls into place. IP filtering is about where the user is, not who the user is. And because we don't know who the user is, and I should put that in quotes, I don't mean necessarily a name. I'm going to talk more about that later, about identities and so forth. But remember I said that the model assumes that if you've got the right IP address, we're going to accept you as anonymous and unauthenticated. So there you are, thousands of people aggregated behind a proxy server. We don't know who any of those people are, the provider doesn't. We don't know where they are, even pretend that we do. And if somebody in that aggregated stream of users does something that they shouldn't, and the provider needs to turn that access off, everybody gets turned off for that resource. You could have 5,000 users under a proxy server, and if somebody's got onto your network, and by the way, that is laughably easy, and inappropriate downloading, and the vendor says, sorry, we have to disable that range until we can talk to you and find out what's going on. 5,000 people can no longer get to that resource until something is fixed and we're all back online. But these two things, these 2 points here on the slide, seem to me foundational. I've already covered some of this. IP address, or IP filtering conflates IP address, location, and identity. We've covered that. It just simply is not so. Another insidious feature that has a consequence of IP filtering is that it has spawned the creation of a lot of proprietary portals. Every institution has a proprietary portal. They have to have. What do I mean by that? If you're just in an internet cafe and you do a Google search and you happen upon an article that you really would like to read and you follow that article link and you wind up at a provider's site and that content is licensed, you hit a paywall, of course. If you really want to get stuff, you've got to start over. You've got to go back and connect to your institution's portal, log in there or whatever your process is, and then do your search under the auspices of that magic IP range and so forth. You see the problem. That is a terrible user experience. But so we've all built these proprietary starting points, and you have to start there if you want your searches to be fruitful. So another way of saying it is, we have an ingrained habit that says you have to come to us first, us being institutions that license electronic content. You can't just go off and search like Discovery really does. You got to come to us first, and then we'll do some magic up front, and then you can do your discovery. IP filtering is a maintenance nightmare. It is, and it is for any number of reasons. But I'll just cite a really egregious one that we're experiencing right now. For the second time in 2 years, our campus IT, official campus IP ranges have been changed by the campus IT group. In other words, official MIT ranges aren't what they used to be. That's been changed. That change, because the vast majority of our providers are doing IP filtering, that change has to be rippled out to over 400 providers. That takes months and multiple staffers working on it, and there's all kinds of time latency. In other words, we can send a notice to a provider and say it's changed. That may be a day's turnaround, it might be a week, it might be 2 weeks, and every one of those 400 plus transactions is an opportunity for error. A finger check and a range gets misidentified and so on. This is just not scalable. It really, really isn't. IP filtering is unsecure and easily exploitable. I hope I don't have to convince you that we are operating in the most toxic internet regime of our lifetime. You all know this. Just one company after another getting hacked and on and on. The idea that we can just have our users kind of wandering around free and easy and unauthenticated and unidentified, out in this toxic wilderness does not make any sense at all. I can't give you data on this, but I'm quite convinced that every one of us who are doing IP filtering, every one of us as institutions who are doing IP filtering, we're leaking data. And there's a quote here that came from another conference that seems to agree from a platform provider. Julie already alluded to this, and I agree entirely. There are two streams of concerns that flow from this position that we're in. And I'll comment a bit on those two streams. They correspond to the ones that Julia already mentioned. Improving the user experience. The first one I think is really quite important. The point of referral for authentication has to move outbound. Right now, we have proprietary portals at our institutions. You want to search or get to our licensed content, you have to start there, and we put you through either a proxy server connection or some campus mechanism of some kind to identify you and so forth. But the point is, it's on the institution's network. That's where the decision about whether to authenticate or not is taking place. It's the wrong place. And that's why people have to come to us first, because we've built it that way. Where should it be? It should be at the provider's site. Let me be very clear about what I mean. You should be able to do a search from wherever, follow a link to a provider's site to licensed content, and as you try to navigate to that licensed content, the provider needs to make the decision, does access to this content need to be authenticated or not? If it's open access, of course, knock yourself out, carry right on. The provider is the point where the decision about authentication or not needs to be made. And if authentication is required, the provider should refer you to your institution so that you can use your institution's credentials, not some proprietary password or something of the sort. If this idea is new to you, it will take some time to take it on. This is a big change, and to the extent that we can make it happen, it will be a big change for the better, particularly for our users. Now, let's say that you're doing this for the very first time. You do a search, you follow a link to the provider's site, and this provider is a very forward-looking provider, and they, in fact, do this. They say, you have to authenticate. Where would you like to authenticate? What institution? They put up a list, and you can pick your institution from that list, click or type in a number, and the next thing you see is your institution's login portal. Let's say that happens. You authenticate, and the next thing you see is you're referred back and you're reading full text. Later that same day or tomorrow or next week, you follow that path again. It would be awfully nice, wouldn't it, if you didn't have to pick from that list of institutions every time. That would be a hassle after a while. You navigate through a lot of things, and you always got to say, I'm from MIT, click that one to authenticate. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a mechanism to remember that that's where you authenticate and just took you there, unless you did something explicit to disable that default? That's something that RA21 takes very seriously and is working very hard on to make happen. All devices must be robustly supported. That was in the title for today's seminar, and I agree entirely. Mobile, in between, whatever. The other main stream, that prior stream was user experience. The other stream is security and all that goes with that, and much goes with it, and we'll hear more about that later today. We need to give up the notion that there's something magic and good about anonymous, unauthenticated access. Anonymous, maybe, or at least partially anonymous. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. But unauthenticated is does not correspond to today's networking environment and today's security situation. I personally think that it is not asking too much to ask our users, no matter who they are, to authenticate with institutional credentials at least once during a browser session. I don't think that's asking too much. You may push back on that, but that's what the conclusion I've come to. And if we're going to do this authentication, let's do it as seamlessly as I've described before, and let's use institutional credentials. By referring back to your institution, we do that. We don't want to keep doing proprietary user IDs and passwords and all that. We must stop that. We really must. And single sign-on, we're going to hear more about that later today too. That must be baked right into this. That has to be at the very heart of this access, and it has to support all devices. So what's a way forward? How am I doing on time, by the way? Okay. I'm making a pitch here for the central idea of federated identity management, which is essentially what RA21 is promoting, only they're fleshing that out in much more detail. By that I mean SAML-based systems like Shibboleth and OpenAthens and others. And it, in general, describes an architecture, if this is new to you, where each institution has an identity provider where they manage and authenticate people and accepts referrals for authentication from any application or site that is participating in the federation. Why federated? Because the metadata exchange that makes that whole mechanism possible would be very hard to scale if every provider had to do a one-to-one connection thing with every one of its customers. This metadata, in fact, can be and has been and is stored in a central location called a federation, and the provider, the institution, anybody can tap that metadata and do their setup in a much more streamlined fashion. We can say much more about that, but we don't really have time to go into that a lot. Authentication referral at the point of need. I've already talked about that. I think that's got to be a part of the way forward. Institutional credentials. Support for affiliation at multiple institutions. I gave you a very simple thought experiment. A user goes to, follows a link, gets stopped to provide or to choose an institution, authenticates, and then goes on. What if, remember I said it'd be nice if the browser or something would remember where you go so you don't always have to pick off that list. It's called that list, by the way, is called a WAYF menu, W-A-Y-F. Where are you from? There certainly are many cases, private researchers and affiliates and so forth, where you may have credentials, you the user may have credentials, legitimate credentials, at more than one institution. So you may need to sometimes authenticate over here and following a different trail for a different journal, and it may be that you have an affiliation over at this institution, you need to authenticate over there. You should be able to do that. The WAYF menu allows that, and that should not be any big deal. If you're in such a situation, you don't set the default that always takes you to the same place. You always get the WAYF menu, and today you pick number 10, tomorrow you pick number 12, you're good to go. Everybody going over most of this. Federated identity management has been available. Shibboleth is probably the most ubiquitous, at least in the educational space, the most ubiquitous example of this, but there are others. But this technology has been around for a long time now, and it is stable, and it works wonderfully. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have some things that could be better, and there are some interesting changes coming along. But this is a solid system with a proven track record. We've been running it for years at MIT for our internal authentication and some external authentication, and it's just one of the most solid things we use. So This is not something new that I'm pointing to. It's just that it's new in the library space for licensed resources. That's the new part of this. Using federated identity management systems of one sort or another to accomplish what we're proposing here is in itself mature technology. Why have we been so slow, libraries and providers alike, why have we been so slow on the uptake with this, with the advantages that it offers? And there are probably many answers to that. I have the sense, just from my own experience, that we're both institutions, subscribers, and providers have kind of been waiting for the other to take the lead. And so we've been waiting for a lot of years, and we're still pretending that IP filtering works and all the rest of it. So I got involved in this initiative back in 2016 because I discovered that it was going on. Actually, I came in under the URA umbrella first. For the first time in my life, I found that there were a bunch of people who were bothered by the problems here and were proposing to get together and try to do something. Not trot out a proprietary solution, but to try to get at the mechanisms and the practices and the infrastructure that would make this so much better. I first got involved with that by attending a conference in Amsterdam, and I was stunned, actually. First time in my life I'd ever been in a room of 50 people or so, and everybody in the room understood the problem. They saw the elephant in the room. I wish I could say that I am a part of a group of academic librarians who also get it. I can't yet say that, but I'm hoping that that's in the making. But that's why I got involved. This problem is so egregious and so long-standing, and we must do better with this. These three subgroups eventually came together in the RA21 kind of convergence, and that's why we're here today under this initiative. And again, most of this is already known. There certainly are more things that could be said here in much more detail. That's not my purpose here this morning. But I represent an academic library, both in this conference and also in general. And I did want to mention some issues that academic librarians in particular are going to care about, and comment on the fact that RA21 is taking them into account. And this is quite important to academic librarians, privacy being right at the top of the list. Academic librarians see themselves as service providers in a way. They're providing access, and they'd like to make that access as complete and as easy and as thorough as possible, and they would like you not to be hassled because you read this journal or that. They'd like you not to be marketed to. They'd like your name not to be sold to marketing people. They'd like your credentials, whatever they might be, not stored and exploited somewhere, and on and on. They'd like your record of activity not to be subject to federal overreach and so on. Privacy matters. Librarians see themselves as, even though they're at a private institution, very often they see themselves as having a kind of public community focus as well. And this is very important. Librarians care a lot about privacy, and that has implications for giving up an anonymity that I mentioned before. Remember, I said that your users behind a proxy server are an anonymous, unauthenticated stream of users. You don't know who these people are. You don't know, the provider doesn't know who they are, and we don't know their authentication status and so on. There are variations in whether that's true in every case, but privacy matters, particularly to academic libraries. One other thing that many libraries care about, and certainly mine does, are what we call walk-ins. What does that mean? It means that the library at MIT sees itself first and foremost as the library for the scholarly work of the Institute, but it also opens its arms to the community to some extent. And this is by no means in every case, but wherever we can with licensed resources, we try to negotiate access for people who come in to use the library. If somebody from the community comes to the library and sits down and browses the internet, do whatever it is that they're doing, we would like to be able to support that to the extent we can. The form that has taken is that in the way we were doing that now, and we are doing it for a number of resources, is that we commit to restricting that kind of openness to a specific set of workstations identified by IP address. Those workstations are in view of the service desk, and they're not hidden away where somebody could be playing games or doing inappropriate things and so forth. And so what we'd like to say is for these workstations, and it's not a huge number, but it's a few in each library, we would like to allow those access to our licensed content where we can make this work, and we'll restrict that privilege just to those workstations. There are other approaches to this, and I'm not here to enumerate them, but this ability to make this exception to a kind of monolithic authentication regime is important to academic libraries. Protection of personally identifying history and usage, that's really subsumed under privacy. And I suspect that when people, librarians who are first coming onto the SAML-based federated identity management structure, where we've said that we no longer do anonymous access. Every user has to have an identity that the provider knows. This identity goes with that session. Librarians are going to be scared, many are, because the default identity is very often first name, last name, and email address. And librarians will say, wait, we're not going to, we don't want to be handing out that kind of data. I would say two things. You're right to be concerned about that. And there is nothing in the RA21's proposals or recommendations, and nothing in the SAML-based federated identity management structure that says that you have to do that. You have to pass some kind of identifier, but it can be opaque. Shibboleth supports this. I'm sure other systems do as well. You do not have to give personally identifying information to the provider. You can, in fact, we're already using this in some cases, you can, in fact, generate a unique string of hex characters that's persistent. That is, the same user will always get that same string when they go to that provider. And that can be the identity. So if you're really, really concerned about this, keep that in mind. You do not have to pass ID and password or name and email. I would point out that notions of privacy around IDs and credentials are changing rapidly. The same users that we're struggling to protect really, really tightly in the library and not giving away anything are putting their email addresses and passwords and everything else all over social media. Something is a little out of whack with that, and so I'm wondering whether we aren't going to need to adjust our notions of what constitutes privacy. But I would recommend this. I'm not a lawyer and I don't do contracts, and there's a really good reason why that is true. But if I were negotiating a contract in this environment, and I decided that, okay, I'm a little scared to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and release name and email address as the attributes. I would have a section in the contract that got real down dirty and specific about what exactly could be done with that information. How will it be stored? How will it be protected? How long will it persist? How is it gotten rid of if my subscription, if we stop subscribing, can't be sold, can't be used for marketing back to the user? It will be tempting for librarians to feel like they're helpless in this. Oh God, and we need infrastructure. Now we got to give our users' identities away. And you're not powerless. And use the contract to exert the control that you feel you need. Would be one recommendation. There are many, many things that could be said about all of this, and again, it's not my purpose here to go deeply into them, but I do want to make that point that librarians don't need to be powerless in this situation. Already covered this. RA21, I believe, is on board with all of this and more. These are some of the advantages. If we go to this kind of environment, more granular control, metadata is federated and made available in an easy way, the proxy server is just not involved in this. And so we reduce our dependence on proxy servers. They're not going to go away. There's going to be quite a number of resources that will not anytime soon be able to support a federated network, and some never will. But we will have reduced our dependence. That's a good thing, because now, under this scheme, with some identity passed to the provider, if inappropriate behavior, downloading or whatever it is, starts taking place, what gets disabled? That user, not 5,000 people. Tremendously important for libraries. Challenges, and again, this is entirely from my point of view and my experience. It can be really tough getting upper management's attention to this issue. I got the scars on my back to prove it. I have been just screaming about this for years now, and I'll spare you the details, but it's really hard to get this on the agenda. IP filtering, because of its simplicity, is tailor-made to be one of those things that upper management says, isn't it working? Yeah. End of story. Never heard of it. Getting buy-in and support from campus IT. This is really important. If you're fortunate, your campus IT group is already involved in federated ID management and an identity provider and so on. And if that's the case, you're 80% of the way there. Implementing the rest of this is not a very big deal. If your campus IT does not currently support any kind of federated ID management, they've got a bit of a hill to climb to get the infrastructure in place. It can be done, but that's a big deal, and you're going to need their cooperation in order to do this. And so if you're in the unfortunate position of not having very good relationships with campus IT, that's going to make this hard, because you're going to need their help and their support in order to make this infrastructure work. Resisting fragmentation of effort. It's just, we're trying to propose an infrastructure that spans provider and subscriber, deals with privacy and with authentication and all the rest of it. This is a big, broad thing, and it needs your campus IT group, it needs the librarians on board, it needs a lot of people. The provider has to be on board. You heard the expression herding cats, that applies here. I'm going to go right past this. You can find these lists of people on the RA21 website. I have in my slides, and I won't take time to divert to it here, but there is a really interesting presentation and video that you might want to watch if you're new to this problem. It's from a couple of years ago, but it's quite good. Here's the most important point I have to make today. If you're a librarian and You already understand federated identity management structure and so forth. This won't be a big deal, but if you're new to that structure, you may very well jump quickly to the notion, oh my God, they're going to change the entire way we do things, and it's going to be chaos, and and that's a reasonable response. We've all seen things like that. This proposal, RA21, is not suggesting that. We're not driving a speedboat here where you turn the wheel and it just goes that way. At best, we're an oil tanker. We have to start turning this wheel, but the change is going to come later, and it's going to be gradual. This is not, nobody in this entire effort is proposing that we somehow put pieces in place, build up to some cutover day, and then one day we throw the switch and woohoo. We're not proposing that at all. If this succeeds, it will be done gradually. This specification will be worked out, enhanced, hopefully agreed upon to some level of specificity. Providers start to implement best practices. Subscribers start to implement best practices. And whenever we can in the future, have a provider and a subscriber who are both on board with this kind of arrangement, we can hook them up. And that's one that now works in a way different from your proxy server. That's one. You've got hundreds more ahead of you at your own pace. So do not get scared by some notion of an abrupt switch over here. That's not what we're proposing. We're proposing to gradually change direction in as thoughtful a way as we can. If you're listening to this and you're not convinced of this or anything else for that matter, I would love to hear from you. I really, really would. Second point, dual stack support. All I mean by that is an expansion on the first point. Even if this all goes into place and RA21's initiatives begin to be implemented and taken on board, we're still going to be supporting proxy servers from now till Tuesday. I mean, there's nothing abrupt about this. Libraries, please, please, please get involved with this. Do not be passive on this. Libraries, for lots of reasons, as I said at the outset, often feel passive and kind of dictated to. Please get involved in this initiative. Make your concerns known. Educate yourself about this technology and whatever others interest you, but do get involved. And this last one is just a personal point, but I personally believe that if we do this carefully and well, we can do it with minimal disruption to our users. Can't promise that there won't be any learning curve at all, but I believe that if we do this well and take our time, we don't need to put our users through a terrible experience. I'm going to end with that and simply invite anybody who's hearing this to communicate with me electronically or any way you like. If you have ideas, thoughts, disagreements, anything, I would love to talk to you more about any of this. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention.
So we have some time for questions. Julia has a microphone. For folks online, I'm going to be messing with what you see for just a minute, so I can perhaps make those really annoying beeps go away.
I think this is working. Yep.
Thanks a lot, Rich. So my name is Mark Beatles. I'm Chief Security Officer for Ohio Link. So we're a consortium of about 120 libraries across the state of Ohio. And I first want to say, yeah, you captured, boy, 99% of the things that we've been observing ourselves. As you say, the technologies, from a technology point of view, it's not new. This is out there. And it works pretty good. I think one of my comments would be, it's more of a comment than a question, but I think it's important. So we've been running Shillum as an option for many of our members for over a decade now. and we have about maybe 10%, if that, adoption across the libraries. Given that there don't seem to be any huge technical hurdles to that, I mean, we know it works. I guess my question / challenge for RA21 is, how is this going to be different than the last decade we had poor adoption? What are we looking at that's going to help steer that ship a little more in the right direction? My own observations, I think mirror some of yours. There seems to be I don't feel lack of cooperation, but a lack of investment in cooperation between campus IT and library services for a variety of historical reasons. I'll say the campus IT are solving this problem in other areas, right? They're very worried about things like financial systems and healthcare systems, and so, those are very privacy-centric too, so they probably have some solutions. The guys at campus IT may very well know what they're doing, I guess, right? On the flip side, though, is what concerns me is cost. We have lots of small rural libraries and stuff like that. And how do we not only say, yeah, this is a great solution, but here's how you justify adopting it on that small budget that you have, right? So I guess those are my kind of comments about this whole thing. It's a great direction. And so I'm hopeful this effort helps kind of push that to the next step.
Thanks for that. I agree entirely. I think we're seeing this in a similar way. I don't have answers to those hard questions, particularly the smaller institutions and so forth. I could speculate about ways might approach that, but that's kind of beyond the scope here today.
So I appreciate the question. I'm one of the chairs of RA21. I'm Ralph Young from ACS, and we're absolutely approaching this not as a technology problem. This is a user experience problem. And as we've been starting to work with some of the federation operators that have been, in this space, for decades at this point, they're welcoming our participation, the publisher participation, with open arms, because they are telling us, we've known this has been a user experience problem for a long time. We haven't been able to find, an industry to come and help us solve this. And so that's what I feel like our role really is to help, solve this for all of us, the user experience challenge. You're going to hear Serena in a moment talk about the user experience challenge and the direction that we are taking to try to address that.
Yeah, hi, my name is Laura McNamara. I'm from Thomas Jefferson University. So we touched on privacy a little bit. And I guess one of the things that I was a little concerned about was the idea that the responsibility was going to be on libraries to negotiate other privacy terms and contracts. And I was wondering if anyone was going to kind of speak to that a little bit more. I think a lot of my background has been in smaller libraries where we don't have any access to university counsel. We don't have anyone with any legal experience. And I think in larger libraries, where we hold departments, so you have university counsel working to negotiate all of your contracts, that might work. So I was just wondering, as part of this process, is there going to be any discussion of guidelines and policies so that that's already established?
So
I can hop in here. Privacy is a big part of the project. We actually have a committee that is looking at the privacy and security aspects of RA21. So we expect that the recommendation will also include guidance on privacy and privacy controls with regard to RA21. Now, it is possible using SAML technology to include all sorts of information about a patron. Guidance in RA21 will be, that's a really bad idea. Use the anonymous token technology. You might include demographic information for tracking student use versus faculty use versus graduate student use. So some very broad demographic information might be useful, but it's entirely up to the institution about what information they provide in the token. The guidance from RA21 will likely be very careful about what you include, A. B, it is up to the institution, it is not up to the publisher what information is provided. And it's entirely up to the institution to push back on any publishers. I mean, there has been some talk in the community about certain publishers asking for inappropriate information in SAML tokens, such as email addresses and things along those lines. And the point of RA21 will be to back up the library when you talk to your provider about the information that they're requesting and say, no, this is, you shouldn't be asking for that sort of information.
Thanks, Todd. If I can just add to that, I'm Chris Shillum with Elsevier, also one of the co-chairs of RA21. With regard to your specific question about having to negotiate contractual terms, there's an initiative in Europe called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into effect in about a month. So all of the publishers, all of the vendors are very, very busy making sure they comply with that law. It's a pretty strong enforcement regime. Certainly, speaking for Elsevier, and I haven't heard anybody else in the industry say differently, we will apply those regulations globally, right? Not just for, in fact, they apply to Europeans wherever they are, but we'll apply them to everywhere. And these regulations are much stronger than anything I've ever seen in an individual contract. Certainly stronger than the legislative regime in the US. So I think almost by definition, if anybody has to do anything, we're going to be in a pretty good situation with regard to privacy and contraction.
So we have a question coming in from some of the remote participants. Federated identity management seems to go against every security step our campus IT wants us to take, such as don't store credentials in browsers, don't use credentials for other authentication, etc. How is this not a security concern?
This is Rich. I'm going to pass the mic to others here, but let me just knock that one down right off the bat. Nobody is proposing that we store credentials in browsers. Nothing. That's just goes against everything that we're talking about here. What we're talking about possibly storing somewhere is the name of your institution. You know, where do I want to authenticate? We are not talking about storing credentials in browsers.
And this is one of the, this is Dan Arala from ProQuest. One of the benefits of using Federation is you actually are keeping those credentials inside the university. They never go to the publisher. They never go to the service providers. And it's being used in the same way that you're already using it to get into third-party HR systems, grade systems, email systems. This is yet one more system to bolt on to that federated system. And it really is a secure way to do it because nothing is being, the university, the institution controls any metadata beyond a random number, token ID that gets sent over. So this is actually the optimal way to maintain security while still enabling usability that users are looking for.
Sorry, hi, I'm Ellen Rotenberg from Clarivate Analytics. I just wanted to mention kind of in context, I think different geographic locations are actually further ahead maybe than others. So something else to think about, you know, for us, some of our customers that buy at the consortium level, like they require us to support plugin with, you know, Shibboleth or other SSO credentials. So I think it's not only size of organization where there's extreme variation, but kind of geographic location as well.
Hi, I'm Andrew Lee with EBSCO. Rich, just kind of one thing that kind of surprised me was you're saying some of the limitations of buy-in from leadership in the library to fully get into this. And I wonder, specifically coming from MIT with the history of Aaron Schwartz and data being leaked to Sci-Hub, you know, what is the barriers for people, especially at MIT, to say, yeah, we need to jump all over this?
If I knew the answer to that, my life would be so much better. I can't say much in detail about that here, other than to say that the farther up the management chain matters like this go, the less they are about the problem and the more they are political. And if you have a particular person with a particular ideology in a fairly high-level position, they can just block any initiative that they don't like for totally non-technical or non-procedural reasons. It's enormously frustrating, and I don't know how to fix that.
Any additional questions at the moment?
Yeah, this is Carla Strebe at Ohio State. I think I'm the Associate Director for Content and Access, and I want to try to do a little bit of reframing of some of the comments, because I'm not sure some earlier points have been fully appreciated, that in the campus environment, our campus IT organizationally owns security of our information systems. They organizationally own our shibboleth services. And while they certainly care about user experience, they're not driving their decision-making from user experience. And I think what we're hearing is that this is not about politics exactly, it's about resources and decision-making. And to expect libraries to educate our IT colleagues and persuade them from inside the organization that this is an issue worthy of their attention and their resources. These services may not, we're working very actively on these issues here at Ohio State with full library leadership support, but our campus IT's structures and decision making are not set up right now to easily support this. It's going to take work, and that's very hard for us to sell as libraries, especially when we ourselves are not the experts on this stuff. And so I think some of the questions highlight how easy it is for our own IT staff to feel that we don't know what we're talking about, because we don't know what we're talking about in this space in terms of the IT work that needs to be done. And so for an initiative like this to get traction, there is going to need to be some direct outreach, not through expecting libraries somehow to convince the OCIO that this is important, but much more directly to campus IT to help them understand that this is a shared campus problem that they need to work with the library community on solving. And I think it's a little naive to think that talking to the library community to persuade senior IT leadership on campus is going to be an effective strategy.
This is Heather Flanagan. I'm the pilot coordinator for RA21, and I agree. If we were just talking to librarians and say, please do the heavy lifting to get the word out to your campus leadership, I would say that is insufficient. However, it's a necessary piece. But we're also reaching out to the identity federations, and through them to as many identity providers, usually the IT departments on campus themselves, asking them to participate, asking them to add their voice for support on campus. I think you actually are in a unique and special position at the Ohio State, because the primary developer of Shibboleth works in your IT department. So he's a very good advocate. That is someone you might be able to talk to and see if you can join forces to make other, perhaps more recalcitrant people move.
Yes, and we are working that route, but it is a struggle to convince even in our environment with that level of advocacy, it is a struggle to convince the campus to make the investments in changing practices to support progress in this space. So we're working on it, but even with that advantage, it's quite difficult here.
Okay, I think with that we'll close the questions at the moment, and we'll hand over to Serena Rosenhan, who's going to talk to us about the UX workshop.
Thanks, Julia. Julia mentioned I'm Serena Rosenhan. I
head user experience at ProQuest, and I'm also leading the UX track of the RA21 work. So this is what I'm going to cover today, a little bit of, Rich did a great job of explaining the problem. I really enjoyed listening to it from his perspective. I will touch on a few themes for the purpose of then connecting that to why the particular solutions are in place that we're proposing. And I'll talk a little bit about the processes that we've been going through and where we currently are, and we're actually going to have a little bit of an interactive demonstration here. We're pretty excited because we're actually beyond just slides and talking. We have something that works at a certain level that proves out some of the concepts, so we're excited to show that to you today. So what and why? We've been talking about this all morning, that it is about these challenges with IP-based management, any device access, patchwork of solutions and pathways once you actually do attempt, if the user will persist in attempting to connect once they get out into a different context of when they're accessing research. Just by way of my background, excuse me, my background and perspective is in user research and contextual inquiry. I have been watching, particularly at the academic student, the user, do research for 10 years, and they always describe it as a paywall, and they always run the other way. So I'm very invested in trying to make this a better experience and getting users who often do legitimately have access to that content to the content, and not just taking another option, some white paper or something that's maybe of less value and less credible, because they get so bogged down in these processes. Let's see here. So, okay. So, just to illustrate, we all use content from many different service providers, many different publishers, and when you're on the campus, within the network, IP authentication makes this seamless. Get in, you're there. When you're not there, proxies, OpenAthons, VPN, many different methods. And this becomes really cumbersome and creates a lot of friction in the workflow. Let me just illustrate. So here's your off-campus, maybe a Google Scholar search. I like to look at this first result. That's my first click. I get to usually an open page. I'm looking at it, looking at the abstract or the information that's available. I want to get that PDF. That's my second click. Oh, guess what? You need to tell me how you want to get into my content. And so if I'm fortunate and know what I'm looking for, I will click the login via my institution link, and that's my third click. Then I need to identify the federation I belong to, because we know every student knows what that is. Not really, I'm being facetious. And that's my fourth click. And somehow I didn't.
Those were your slides. Do you want to go to your demo?
No. Something happened with my slides. Did I upload the wrong thing? I know. Okay. It's just this is opposite. Not sure how we all get that, but yeah, apologize for that. Let me just flip through here. So I think we were on click number 4. There we go. And then you get to pick your institution. And then you go to your institutional page. And if you're still with us, then you've gotten into your content. And those of you who work with even not just students, sometimes we give students a bad rap. No researcher wants to do that, right? So that's the problem, just to make it very literal, very tangible. what we're trying to do is implement a consistent user experience regardless of location or device used. And this is something I think that's very, I don't know if it has been emphasized as much in the early conversations, but as a real advantage, I think, to what we're trying to do with the user experience. So I learn a way in, and I can use that way, and it works every time. There's nothing more frustrating than to be trained on how to get into something and then it doesn't work when you're not in the right context and you haven't gone into the right order. As Rich was speaking about, if you don't start in the right place, then your experience is different. So that's what we're trying to address here. How? How are we trying to address it? Again, a SAML-based federated approach. We're going to rethink the user experience, that 4 or 5 clicks where you have to step through and pick the identity and the institution. We're really trying to think about how to make that have less friction, be more inviting to users, and we'll talk about the principles that we're applying there. We know it will never be seamless, but our goal, we like to talk about, is as seamless as possible. And we're doing this in a learning process. We're testing, we're going to improve our solutions, we've got our pilots, and we're going to come out with those best practice recommendations. This just explains that we really did try to take a user experience first, not technology first approach here. And it was, what should it be, what should it be like, and then how can we pull together the technology that supports that. That's very much the process that we're engaged in right now. So the user experience that we are envisioning and proposing to accomplish all these goals we've been talking about all morning. This shows that we've been using good UX practices. We've been trying to understand who our users are, where they're working, what is their context of use, what are their common workflows. We're creating some prototypes, which we'll show in a moment, and we're testing those prototypes with real users. And so, these are actual, have the user do the clicking, walk through, observe if it's usable, observe what's working, what isn't working. So not just sort of asking them what they think, but actually watching what they do. So our UX, user experience recommendations, I'm going to talk about a couple of foundational building blocks to the experience, and then I'll show you all of those, how they come together in action. One of the core features that we've landed on, and that is testing in a very solid way, is having this consistent call to action. Something that will be the same regardless of the publisher site that you're on, regardless of the way that you come in, and it will be the consistent, clear, visible queue. This is what we have right now. We've tested a few iterations. This is our working sort of best version, and one of the things that we like about it is it communicates that idea of this relationship that the user has with the institution that provides them the access, and that becomes something that they quickly remember and identify. We've been experimenting with a little bit of a guided step-by-step description below that you see below to help set the expectations for what happens when you click that button, so that the mind frame isn't. Another route we might have taken is I click on the link that asks for full text, but then I get routed through these screens that are asking me for information and institutions, and that's not what I thought was going to happen when I clicked on that link. So we're really trying to set the right frame of mind so that a user can progress very quickly and minimal friction through this process. So you'll see that in once we get to the place where we need to identify their institution, we've tried to make this process really smart. And I'm sure there's ways that we will continue to work on that, but there's not just one way to identify it. There will be a lookup, and you can type in a name, you can type in an abbreviation, you can type in your email address if you're normally entering your email as your institutional credential and you think, oh, I'll try that. And we're working on recognizing really taking any input that the user can give us and trying to find a match for that. So I think one thing that's really important here is the school abbreviation. As long as it's provided in the Federation metadata, we'll return a match. And you'll see some examples of how that's already working in the prototype. And we're doing type ahead. So as you start to type things in, the matches will appear. You don't have to even completely finish your entry and then guess. And as you know, what this is a good practice that helps cue the users to are they on the right track? Are they, oh, that's what they're looking for. Let me try entering the thing. Now I know what you're asking me, and you can actually kind of course correct if things are not matching. Another thing that we're doing here is, you know, these are the lists of things that you can pick from. You'll notice over, oh, it's not showing up. It's not showing up on the screen. It's showing up here on my screen. There should be a little mini URL here, and hopefully you'll see that in the prototype. So if we're University of Minnesota, it'll say umn.edu at the top. I don't really know why it's not.
It's a bad projector.
It's the projector. Yeah.
They're seeing it online.
Oh, good. The online folks will see it. You have the advantage today. But it's a reinforcing cue, right? So what we're trying to build into this whole experience is proper expectation setting, and then that's what we call scented information. And that helps set an expectation again. Oh, when I select this, I'm going to this familiar place. And then remembering, and Rich spoke about this. So the things that, the choices that I've previously made in this step, not my credentials, but my choice, my institution choice, will be remembered and save me the step of searching when I come back the next time. Again, and this isn't that different from the kinds of experiences that most users are used to with account choosers in other contexts. But it would be there, and you can switch if you do have those multiple identities like Rich was speaking about. But regardless of which provider you visit, if you're using the same tool, the same device, then it would know that this was a valid path for you. This is the one that you selected before. And I think with that, we're going to get to the exciting part. So we're going to switch over to a demo, and I've actually asked Rich to come up and just to show that it actually works. I don't know Rich's credentials. He's going to use his own, and we're going to walk you through this. Now, there are some parts that are, this is still a demo. It is somewhat mocked up, but the authentication mechanism is real, and it's working. And we're not taking Rich into Rich's content. There's some demo content there. So let me just get us to like stop here. I don't know the URL off the top of my head. Ralph knows it. Yeah, I have it in the deck. So I'll just switch back to the deck. I got it. No, I think I got it. He's got it. Yeah. All right, there we go. Thank you for your patience. The last time I did this, I didn't have it in Chrome. It's a prototype. We just fixed it in one browser, and it wasn't great. So, all right. So I'm going to have Rich drive. Step over here. And Rich, you've done a search on biodegradable and sustainable fibers. Can you hear me up? And you're interested in the second one there. That's for ProQuest. There's an actual reason here. All right, so you've taken a look. This is a dissertation. You're kind of excited. You're thinking it's a good one, and you're going to get this very clear cue. So go ahead and click through there. Okay. So you notice that it's showing up, the URL's there. And you can't see, but it is right here. If you're really close to the screen, you can see the URL. Go ahead. go ahead and pick the one that you would like to use. This is his actual live.
That's the one. That's MIT. IDP talking to you right there. Whoops. I can't do that. Of course.
So he'll identify himself to his institution in the way that he would anywhere else that he does that. And this is something we're starting to see, and we're actually interested in the Duo experience. Of course, this he hasn't used this device before. I should have prepped you for that possibility.
No, it's okay. I do this about 100 times a day.
Ideal if you're on your own device, that's going to be less friction. But I think this is a great thing to just, as we've just started to see this, I saw this happen natively, and there you are. No, you're not done yet. So, so now he's got the full text, and he's going to be able to read the whole dissertation. You can tell that because there's a PDF, there's links up there. What's that? Oh, and also we've got this is just a concept right now, but you see that the access is provided by Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, that's picking it up from the fact that that the referral was there. So that's a real data being pulled in. And that reinforces that cue through the whole experience. Now, if you'll pop back over to the tab for Google Scholar, let's say you want to continue your research. There's other content out there. I'd love for you to stay in ProQuest, but it's all right if you go someplace else. I want you to be successful in your research.
Pick the third one. Pick the third one.
Yeah! Look at this great article from American Chemical Society. So you need to get into that article. You decide it's one you've got to have for your important research. Yeah, you notice it wasn't as easy to find. And that's actually one of the things that we're learning as we're doing usability testing is there's a real power in the placement there, and I'll talk about that.
Right.
So now, what's happened? Yeah. So it's already remembered you.
Right.
Ideally, we'd like to have a little bit more of a visual, like the icon's not showing up, I think, because we don't have a good one in the prototype. But go ahead and select your institution. And it remembers you're still authenticated, so you're in.
In the same browser session.
In the same browser session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
So that's the demo. And then there's another link that works with another set of content to show you. But that's the idea and what we've worked on so far. Thank you very much. Use slideshow. Say that again, Kevin. Got it. All right. So a couple of things about what you saw. And I mean, you can actually take questions if you want, but I'll just explain that is sort of what we are calling it level 1, which is a basic, least technically complex implementation. And it would be something that would ideally be very simple for a service provider to just plug into their experience. I'm going to try to describe this without being inaccurate. Essentially, it's all about where you put that button and that link that links out to the experience. And we have ideas of how we could cut more steps out of the process with some additional levels of complexity here. So first, in the least technically complex implementations, this is what we just saw. There's a resource, you're on an Elsevier page, you click access, you look it up, you enter your credentials, this is using a corporate model, and you get to your content. But for the second one, you get to your resource, it asks you, are you still with the last institution that you used? Yes. and you get right in. So that's what we just saw. The same thing would happen with the third resource, again, same within the same browser session. And I think there's some questions around, well, could it be longer? Is there some, how long do we remember things? I think that's one of the things we're still discussing. But all subsequent visits to the publisher site provide seamless access to content for some period of time, and that's a little bit open-ended here. There's another level that we're talking about to try to cut some steps out, and I'll show you another view of this. But the idea would be that instead of always maybe having to confirm your institution, maybe we suggest your institution. Maybe we bring that forward a step and have a flavor of that button that actually communicates the institutional choice that you've made. And that's what this is showing here. So that it's taken out a step. That makes sense. So that might look something like this, where instead of access through your institution, something generic, it becomes access through a specific institution. And that will take you straight to the authentication portal. But this is going to require a little more customization, a little bit more, it's not just going to be sort of the plug and play version that we're discussing. We don't know exactly, we'll test out this, maybe something along the lines where there's more of a visible queue here. It's just a concept. But that's the idea here, is that we will continue to improve and iterate. So by building this out, this experience out, it makes it so that we can actually see ways to streamline it and improve it over time. So I'll just speak a little bit about kind of where we are in this process. We have the demo that you just saw. We have been trying to, we have been testing it with actual users, some students, we're in the process of working, setting up some tests with some of our corporate partners and some more researchers, and we're in that process right now. But I'll give you some of the early feedback from basically 2 rounds of studies that we've done. So just to let you know, we tried out a few different options for the queue, and we did find a pretty strong preference in that test that the label institution was successful and resonated, and it set the expectations and helped set them up for success. So that's what we're recommending right now. We will obviously keep testing, and if we learn something new, we'll adjust. The visual button was very powerful, a powerful mechanism. And one of the things that we came away from these tests, and we'll be recommending, I'll talk about that in a moment, is that we are all going to be better off if that's easy to see and easy to find and in a consistent location. And I think that's something that we can support with feedback from the testing that we have. And there's some recommendations around organizing all of the calls to action, maybe in a clearer panel and group, will make people more successful. Users still are going for that PDF link, and that tends to, depending on the publisher's page and how those things are set up, can create some confusion because they don't get to PDF. And then there's a lot of options. A lot of our pages have purchase options and individual account options and SAML options and direct options, and we think the user will be better off if we can organize and create a clearer hierarchical pattern for these options. So again, the projector is not great here, but some of the recommendations that we'll be making are to cluster the article access options together so that a user can make a good choice and understands them as equivalent options and quickly identify the one that they are most likely to be successful with. And this just illustrates the illustration on the left illustrates, let's just put them in one place instead of kind of scattered along the top, down at the bottom, on the side. One of the things I think as providers we often do is we kind of take our pages where users are already authenticated and in the system, and we just sort of think, well, let's make those publicly accessible, and then take the things away that they're not supposed to see, and we don't really rethink about that completely different context of it, and think about those as a point of entry. We can do better. And so the other thing we have to do is, if we're clustering them, then we might need to think about helping to provide some hierarchy. And this might be something that publishers have different reasons for doing in different ways, but the goal here is to put forward the option that will get your users the most success. So if your users primarily have an individual relationship with you, and they're going to be most successful if they log in and through their own individual account, that would be the thing that you would want to prioritize, and have these other options available as well. But that's along the lines of some of the things that we're learning from the testing. We are in progress testing the live prototype, and a lot of the findings that we've tested. Judy, do you know how many you've tested so far? Dozen?
I would say in the order less than 50.
Okay.
I mean, at least for.
Okay. So in the order of a couple dozen tests so far, and still the placement of the access through institution does make a big difference. People aren't scrolling. PDF download, I've talked about that. One of the things that we've learned is that originally a lot of our theories or hypotheses around user experience was, let's make this easier on users. Let's just ask them for their email address, because they know that, they don't have to, it'll take some of the cognitive burden off. And that is a fine hypothesis. We just didn't find that to play out as strongly as we expected it to as we started to research, because people don't always know which email address you're asking them for. And we found that they were able to be more successful by identifying that institution, recognizing that relationship, and they knew what to enter. So that said, we are still supporting email as a means of providing a domain that we can find a match to. So if someone is very used to just typing in a particular credential that is in the form of an email, and there's a match there, they will still be successful. So we're trying to open up the types of inputs that will lead them to a successful conclusion. One of the things that we see play out is the users are picking up on that pattern, that visual cue, and it doesn't bother them that it's in one provider and another, and it's actually working quite well. They find the remembering to be very beneficial. I think we have some things we'd like to work on with the visual styling, and maybe there's some improvements that we can make there. I don't know if you noticed in the prototype, we actually had some of a step-by-step instruction once you get to the Find Your Institution page in the footer that reinforced that 1, 2, 3, this is going to be a process, there's going to be some steps here. That doesn't seem to be making a lot of difference. People don't actually seem to need that. We may try dropping that and see where that goes. So we're going to finish our level 1 testing. We've got some additional testing. We're going to be updating the prototype and getting the prototype a little bit more robust and production ready, some design refinement, making sure it works in other browsers besides Chrome, making sure it works on all devices. That's kind of a step 2. We're working on the responsive piece of that, making sure it's accessible to screen readers and browser compatible. There's a few different layers of feature that we haven't worked into this very first cut that we'll probably be adding in. For example, when you get to that first Find Your Institution screen, there may be some things that we can bring forward as suggestions that will streamline the process. And I think we're going to try some of those ideas. Again, pinning down some of this, how much is remembered and how much can we remember. And then we have some questions around when somebody does have their individual account and their individual ID, making sure that we aren't tripping over each other, that those two processes are complementary, and that the user can clearly enter the account that's, and whether it's their personal account with the publisher or their institutional account, that they can clearly understand where they are. And then we're going to be working on some of the nuances of the more customized, the versions that will allow us to maybe streamline and bring a little bit more customization for publishers. So I think that is what I had to cover today. I'm going to pause and open it up for some questions.
Thanks, Serena, and Rich for being a guinea pig. Do you have any questions?
This looked really good, by the way, thanks. One of the things that I wonder is it seems like there's an assumption that from the institution point of view that as long as they provide the right metadata, that there's not much else they need to be doing other than providing the right metadata with their logo and name and accepting the authentication. And the standardization is really more on the provider side for this sort of thing. Is that a correct assumption, I guess?
I think, yeah, Ralph and Chris are nodding their heads,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think that does kind of harken back to the previous question we had from Ohio State about, you know, how much effort are we really asking of campus IT in order to make this happen? The answer is really not much, right? If you have the SAML infrastructure already deployed, which by and large, you know, you all do, we may be suggesting some additional metadata that you can put into your metadata, some additional attributes into your metadata, so that it will make it easier. Like, do you have alternate names for your institution in your metadata? So the search is going to come up with whatever names your users would naturally use for your institution name. Do you have your logo in the metadata? It looked like Rich's campus didn't have the logo in the metadata, so we weren't able to pick it up. You know, we're writing a white paper. Actually, Heather can talk about that. She's authoring a white paper that is recommending additional hints like that to make sure that you have, but not much more that really needs to be done in order to participate in this.
Thanks so much. I'm curious, are you thinking of this as a set of guidelines for implementation, or are you thinking of this more as a service that publishers can plug into their systems?
It's a really good question. So I think there are a couple of levels to that. The persistence of remembering your institution across publishers requires some central infrastructure of one kind or the other. And there are a couple of technical options that we're exploring for that still. One's browser-based, one's cloud-based. So we do think there will need to be a trusted, neutral third party to host that central infrastructure. That's going to be it then, and it'll be up to the usual sets of vendors, publishing system, platform providers, etc., to actually do the integration of the UI. One of the options we have, and one you can actually download here, is where that discovery service, that search interface, is also centrally hosted, right? So that's a really lightweight implementation for publishers. They only really have to put the kind of button on their page and hand the link back. That's something that already exists. So those central discovery services for SAML have been around for a long time. So the only thing we're really doing in terms of centralized infrastructure is layering on, once we pick one of the options, the mechanism to remember that institution choice across publishers. And that turns out to be quite complicated because it's to do with cross-domain systems or technical stuff. But if once it's worked out, it's pretty easy to do in terms of some of the big complicated thing that needs to be hosted somewhere.
Any other questions?
If anybody wants to play with the demo that's here in the room later, see if your institution, how your institution fares, just let me know. Yeah, I just.
Okay, so we have.
Yes, I'm going to.
So after the UX, we're going to have a look at the security and privacy issues. Reginald Zamora coming up.
It's freezing. Hello, everyone. Reginald Zamora, the CISO for Wiley, Chief Information Security Officer. So basically, I'm going to start with, I guess, my first question before I get into the presentation. Have any of you guys experienced Zscaler? Aha, so you're aware of it. So basically, for those who are not aware, this kind of affects how the proxy works. So if your campus IT implements that security, basically goes behind the proxy, and instead of having a fixed IP, as we all expect, right, the same thing that Rich talked about, it randomizes the IP for us. Good from a security perspective, they scrub the traffic that's going through Zscaler for malware and viruses and such. Good from an availability perspective because they randomize and create pools of outbound access into where you need to go to the internet. But it kind of kills the whole access methodology, right? So once you go behind Zscaler, all the IPs change all the time. So we experienced this at Wiley. We started getting calls from customers. A lot of the institutional customers, actually, about 200 from what I know, saying they lost access. Why'd you drop access? We didn't do anything, right? They implemented Zscaler, campus IT, and randomizes the IP, and we're expecting specific IPs from these places, and now they're all over the place. So just beware, that's coming. That's the other reason why we need to start looking at SAML. So that was that. So I know I'm between you and lunch, so I'll try to be concise. Plus I'm cold. All right, so in terms of the security and privacy working group for RA21, this is actually my, I'm fine. This is actually my second meeting. But there are a lot of people in the group. There is a 30-page work paper supporting this with about, I think, 30 names. So we have Wiley, we have Adapon in there, ACS, ProQuest, IEEE, a bunch of university. There's a lot of people. So basically, I guess if you need a copy, we'll provide the copy to anyone, right? Once it's final.
Yeah.
So it's still in draft, by the way. So I'll go fast. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to assess the security and privacy of the two pilots that we've been talking about. And then we were asked to provide recommendations based on what we reviewed. So to do that from a security perspective, we did some threat modeling for the architecture that was presented. And for the privacy perspective, we actually executed a data protection impact assessment based on GDPR, because it's coming and all the publishers need to comply with that, right? So that I can tell you, it's been a painful project inside the company. So quick summary, there are no significant risks. Again, all that's being collected are randomized hex characters, so it's fairly low in value. There's nothing you can do with that even if you stole it. We're not collecting any credentials. The residual risks from both security and privacy are low. Even if you, for example, took out the discovery services, again, the authentication happens at the institution, so it is a very low impact. And in addition to that, the pilots are very well designed from scratch so that the appropriate safeguards are in place. For example, in addition to being a hex string, which is, again, fairly useless to attribute to a person, it's also encrypted. I know that Wave Cloud encrypts it using bcrypt. So it's a pretty good implementation. Just to give you a difference between Wave and P3W, the Wave Cloud, of course, stores not credentials, the metadata centrally, so it, of course, has a higher attack surface. But again, if you take it out, it doesn't take a lot of, sorry, let me stop that. I'm cold. I'm really freezing. I think the vent is here for some reason to make me go faster. So, but basically the level of data involved, the way it's stored, it is encrypted. There's nothing in terms of authentication data, nor is there any confidential data according to GDPR, right? Sensitive high-risk data like criminal records, health records, or anything like that. There's none of that nature. And again, bottom line is the priority is low based on the threat modeling that was done. If you want to sleep if there's a night you can sleep, I would say download the security and privacy work paper. These are the things that you'll see. It's not as exciting as the demo, but basically, we used Microsoft's method to do a threat assessment on the architecture that was presented. So it's called the Microsoft Stride model. That's just to make sure that we did have a structured approach at security for the architecture. So Strides, I forgot what it stands for at this point, but one is spoofing, for example, two is tampering, D's for DDoS. So that's how we made sure we covered all the required elements in reviewing the architecture. P3W is next, so that has a much lower attack surface because nothing is actually collected or stored. Everything's on your browser, other than going through the directory service. So that's even a lower risk than the other pilot. Again, sleeping material, P3W, the Stride threat modeling for that is actually much more detailed than this, and the privacy impact assessment is even worse. So summary, the data is randomized, and you can't really attribute it to a natural person, so again, low risk. I talked about the second point already, and it is encrypted and salted. I was pretty impressed as a security guy to see that by default and without consultation, they encrypted it and salted it. So salted means not just hashing it, but also creating random characters to make it harder to crack. So they did that by default, so that was pretty impressive. This is part of the privacy risk assessment. Again, there's 30 pages, so feel free to read it again on an exciting night. We created risk by, based on the data privacy impact assessment, and then we did a risk ID by pilot. And then the end result is between the threat model that we did and the privacy impact assessment, we came up with recommendations for each pilot. And you'll see that information soon, I guess, once it goes final. Beautiful. Any questions? Sure.
Make sure I don't get cold over.
No problem. Thank you. I guess it's not clear to me if this is available to read or not, because you two gave different answers on that.
It's still in draft. That's why.
Is the draft available to read?
I think so. I leave it up to the chair.
What qualifies someone to be able to read the draft? How? That would be fantastic.
There you go.
I think that's what I was getting at. I actually will read this and probably not sleep because of it. One of the things that's not clear to me, because I don't think we went into it today, what's the functional difference between the cloud WAF and the in the browser WAF? Other than, this one has a cloud piece. What's the functional difference? Can somebody in 2 seconds?
Sure. So the piece of information we need to store is the user's IDP preference, right? The entity ID of their user, right? The complexity is that in order to, there's no functional difference essentially. There's a trade-off between the size of the infrastructure, having a server with data on that essentially manages these pairs of anonymous device ID to IDP preference that sit in a server somewhere. That's the cloud approach, right? So you have to build a server with a database and the rest of it, right? The P3W approach is that sits in the browser and browser local storage. So much lighter weight, but then there's some cross-domain browser security model complexity to get that data to each service provider site, right? So that's the trade-off.
Is one of the goals of persistent sessions across devices in the one?
Not sessions, because sessions are persistent on the IDP.
Preferences.
Yes.
Okay, so
That's the goal.
Okay, so there's another piece there which is the cross browser.
Yeah.
We know who has the beeper. Is it in the jacket?
It's probably the lunch shot
That's what I
alarm.
was looking for. I was taking my colleague's bag outside.
I think it's maybe in the jacket.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just take everything outside.
President trees are not like this.
This is the next
Sorry,
generation of
stuck in
employees.
the chair.
So,
Apologize.
can I just check that everybody heard Chris's explanation and weren't distracted too much? Everybody okay with the difference between P3W and the wave cloud approaches? Yeah, great. Thanks. Any other questions for Bridget?
Not a question, a comment. Thanks very much for doing that level of work on this. That will go some distance to establishing the seriousness of this effort. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we pass over to Chris? Who's up next? Thanks, Rich.
Well, folks, thanks so much for joining us today. I think it's really great to see the kind of concrete progress we've made on these two work streams. The UX stuff is really cool, and again, I just want to stress that's real working software. The Google page and the publisher pages are mocked up because we haven't done all the integration work yet, but the signing in with Rich's ID was live, the discovery search was live, so I really want to thank Leif Johansson from Sunet, which is the Swedish IDP, for doing the work to bring that up. Great work from Reggie and the team on these very complicated things that I don't quite understand, and I'm glad there are people who do. So just to wrap up, one of the reasons that we've brought this initiative together, there are specific challenges in our world that we don't see on the consumer web, that we don't see also in some of the other things that we might be using, like what I call SaaS solutions, like online HR solutions and all that kind of thing, right? So, unlike the B2C, the websites we all use in our personal lives, there aren't just 2 or 3 predominant identity providers that we all use, right? There's this big proliferation of thousands. I think we have something like 6,000 SAML IDPs in our set of metadata from all of the federations we participate with at Elsevier. So that is what creates this unique wave problem, right? And I think, to answer the question that was asked earlier, I think that's been the fundamental barrier to adoption of SAML, Shillum. The technology's there. Solving the WAIF UI has been the challenge, right? I think we've now brought in the kind of professional expertise of UX professionals to really solve that problem once and for all and do a good job. We also, as we heard very clearly from Rich, heard that we need a solution at point of access, right? When the person has reached the resource provider, haven't they got there from a Google search, from PubMed, wherever, they need to be able to easily get back to their home institution to authenticate. And I think, again, that's the other reason that SAML is such a compelling solution here, because it's pretty much the only solution, the only technology out there that provides a standardized mechanism for you to get from a resource to an identity provider to authenticate. As we've heard, there are requirements in our community for very strong privacy protection and this support for anonymous access, which again is why SAML-based solutions with their ability to provide anonymized attributes and not personal identity, it seems like the right technology here. And as we've heard, in order to get users to the point where they understand what they need to do, we really need some kind of consistent and standardization of the UX across resource providers. And I think that little blue logo, or whatever that ends up being, I'm sure that's not finalized yet, but once folks start seeing that consistently on all the resource providers' sites, it's really not going to be a big challenge for them to figure out what they need to do. So some of the key advantages of this kind of solution as well, there are lots of folks trying to do other things. Obviously, there's the big installed base of proxies and VPNs.
There are approaches where you can kind of pair devices when you're on campus, so you can use them off campus. Google have recently come up with something called CASA, but pretty much they all leverage IP under the covers, apart from VPN, okay, but everything else relies on the fact that there is the mechanism for authentication between the institution and the service provider's IP, and these are always to either fake IP or extend the reach of IP outside the network. And we've heard, I think, some very compelling arguments why that's not the right approach. They also all pretty much require pre-configuration, right? When the user gets to that point of access from the Google search, unless they either have some knowledge about what they need to do, or they've previously done something, they're stuck, right? And that's what leads to this enormous user frustration, and leads people to folks where they can just get the resources from illegitimate places because it's less effort. The nice thing about SAML also is that this mechanism of anonymous tokens, which enable service providers to know who the user is when they come back, even if they don't know the identity of the user, means that the publishers can do what they want to do, which is offer more value, save researchers more time by offering personalized solutions and tailoring the user experience to the needs of a particular user, with still leaving full control of the user about what personal information they might choose to disclose to the service provider in order to do that. As we heard also, this idea that the user is being authenticated as an individual at their home institution, even if the service provider doesn't know who they are, means that we have a much more targeted approach to addressing security issues when they come up, right? We don't have to block whole IP ranges that might have thousands of users behind them. As Rich said, the individual problematic credential can be cut off. And there are emerging standards in the SAML community, in the identity management community, starting to provide some automated mechanisms for reporting that kind of problem and sharing that in a trusted way among identity providers. Another thing we didn't talk about, but we're working on with the corporate pilot, is the idea to completely separate out the way that we do granular usage reporting. We hear that a lot, particularly from corporate customers, also in some academic cases as well, that the customer would like to get their usage reports sliced in all kinds of different ways that are meaningful to them. And today there tend to be lots of complicated configuration requirements where people have to send lists of their organizational units to 400 providers. Every provider does it separately. One of the things we're working on the corporate provider is, hey, let's just make that another attribute, right? The identity provider passes a thing to us, a code that says, put this usage in this bucket. The publisher doesn't need to know what it is, doesn't know what it means, doesn't have to know when it changes. All they need to do is, record that piece of information in their usage logging system and provide the ability to filter on that in the usage reports. So we haven't quite finalized that yet, but we think that's another compelling advantage of this approach. A little bit on kind of where we are and what we're doing next. As you heard today, we are really wrapping up the output of these two work streams, the UX work stream and the security and privacy work stream. We also have some early outputs like the white paper that Heather is writing on the recommendations for SAML metadata. Our next step, probably in Q3, will be to actually publish our recommendations as a draft via the NISO process and open that up for public comment and consultation following the norms of NISO. And then, that normally takes, I think, about 3 months to go through that process. We hope to publish the final recommendations by the end of the year. The other thing that we alluded to earlier on is this need for a fairly thin but nevertheless necessary piece of centrally hosted infrastructure in order to allow that identity provider choice to be persisted among participants. One of the things we want to do is make sure that we think about how that's going to happen. So we've started the process to have some discussions with the usual suspects, trusted neutral third parties who might be interested in operating that thin layer of central infrastructure. Then beyond 2018, this is all going to be about adoption, and as you heard from Rich and you heard from other folks, This is not a big bang. I like the phrase you use with this kind of dual stack mode, Rich. You know, it's going to be a long transition, but there's a lot of work to do in terms of outreach, education, getting this out there, and that's where we think that STM might step back a little bit, having defined the best practices, and NISA is very, very good at running these engagement processes, and we think NISA will kind of step to the fore there. So that's it from us. We're doing lots of outreach material. Have a look at our website where the presentations are on the latest information. We continue to be on the road presenting at any relevant conferences. So if you know of one that we're not coming to visit and you'd like somebody to come and talk to that, we're more than happy to do so. And I think we now have 600 folks on our mailing list just to keep informed of the effort. So if you're not on the list and would like to be added, just let one of us know and we'll get you guys added. Great, so that's it for today. And happy to take any other questions.
With regard to your point about building certain kinds of customized services that leverage user attributes, I just want to clarify the metadata that the identity provider makes available to the publisher is that's determined by the library or the university.
Yeah.
So that can have a low or a high threshold.
Absolutely.
And that threshold would never be mandated.
Yeah, so there is already essentially a convention in this place in Shibboleth and SAML. The very minimum is we need an attribute that says, hey, this user should get your, right? And there's a convention for that attribute, and that's the minimum, right? Otherwise, we don't know that the user is meant to get the stuff. Typically, most SAML implementations provide something that's called a targeted ID, which is this pairwise, unique, opaque ID for the user that says, hey, if you've seen this code before, it's the same person, right? And then typically what publishers do is that if they see that, they allow the user to register so they can get all the personalized services, alerts, and all that stuff. But certainly speaking for our implementation of SAML, that's optional, right? The only baseline requirement is this member of attribute or whatever it's called that says, hey, this person, you don't need to know who they are, we've signed them in, they should get your stuff.
With the concept of RA21, where does the idea of permission sets for a particular group of users reside? Is that some identity providing applications have this notion of a permission set that is managed within that structure? Where does RA21 see that? How do user attributes relate to permission sets, and then where is that permission set configuration housed or stored?
Could you speak a little bit more about what you mean by permission sets? Because I think
so. If I have a group of users, I'm identifying them by attribute, but I'm also deciding to give them access to a different group of resources within my organization, and I do that. At least I'm thinking of. That's what I'm thinking of as a permission set.
Sure.
So I'm differentiating between levels of access or extent of access.
Sure.
How does RA21 work with that?
I don't think we've really brought that into the scope of RA21 because that's really an authorization question and not an authentication question. It's once you know who they are, what should they get. Typically in Shibboleth SAML, you can do that in either place, right? Either the identity provider can authorize the user and provide, that they should get my stuff attribute based on who you know the user is, or you can provide attributes in the response that put users into various groups, and the service provider can decide what to do with those, right?
One of the comments we've heard as we've gone through this is the desire to ensure that data doesn't pass between the various publishers and service providers. So keeping this at an identity level, you are authorized, you are a member of this, and putting the access levels into each of the individual providers' systems would be a way to ensure that none of that information can leak across.
And it's because it is specific to each service provider, how that access is able to be granularized.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say there is one particular use case, maybe to get to your question a little bit about permission sets. You know, we're hoping to be able to leverage this, things like header edge person schema, which is an attribute, a standard SAML attribute that you could be asserting to publishers that would allow us to differentiate between faculty versus staff versus emeritus versus alumni or something like that. And I'll just toss out a particular use case that might be of value to you. As some publishers are now working with you on open access charges, and we want to be able to validate that the people coming to us to pay for open access charges are actually members of your institution. Perhaps you would not want an emeritus faculty or an alumni to be, even though they might have an account with you, a legitimate identity with you, to be able to draw down on whatever budget you've set aside for OA fees or something like that. This is the kind of world that we would be able to move into with these attributes that we really have no ability to do today. So I don't know if that's an example of the kind of thing we're thinking of. Yeah, okay, good.
So imagine a future a few years from now where this is the ubiquitous medium for accessing licensed material. Does RA21 go away, or does it persist in some form? And if it does, how's it governed?
Sure, excellent question. So we're a project. We want to go away. You know, one of the things I learned from a gentleman called Jeff Gordon. I don't know if you know him. He's got a very good presentation to say you never want to fund things that should be long-lived via projects, because at some point projects go away, right? So the only thing that we think needs to be persisted in terms of infrastructure is this thin layer that provides the mechanics, the plumbing, so the sharing of IDP choice among participants. And as I say, we've started to have discussions with a number of third parties who could take that on, and we've drawn up some criteria which I think are on the website somewhere about what would qualify those third parties, but being neutral, non-profit, having an open governance structure, etc. Are those criteria. I would imagine that when we reach a conclusion to that, then the governance structures will be defined in conjunction with whoever that third party is who operates that service. So there's a bit of a vague answer because we're still working on that. But yeah, we don't want to form another organization, yet another organization to run this thing. We think there is a bit that needs running, and we think there are a number of organizations that are pretty well qualified to take that on.
Hi, Ian Brennan from Walter School. So we mentioned the adoption of other authentication methods has taken a long time. Right now we're looking at things like IP authentications and targeted single sign-on solutions, corporate, Shillum, Open Athens, and now RA21. Are there any ideas on how we can push uptake implementation, or is that outside the scope?
No, not at all. So, RA21 is building on all of those things, right? It's building on Shibboleth. Open Athens is a provider of SAML-based services and very much involved in the group, right? So we think that the key thing that's slowed adoption of the technology, which has been in place, are two things, right? First is the UX has been lousy, right? So that's what we're really trying to fix. And the other thing is this differentiated experience between on-campus IP where you don't have to do anything, right? And off-campus where you have to do some weird thing that's different for every combination of institution and service provider, right? So, one of the things that we hope to do, and as we say, it's going to be a gradual transition, right? But when we can convince the first institution to try turning IP off, and it becomes a uniform experience no matter where you are, we think that will also drive and accelerate adoption. But only when institutions are ready. I really want to stress that. Right?
Any other questions?
Just to tag on to what Chris was saying,
starting to get a little bit of anecdotal evidence that this same method from everywhere, I think, is going to end up becoming very attractive. And one of the things that it does, particularly in the academic space, is it reinserts the library into that process. The library no longer is invisible as the provider of this content. And I think that could be a very persuasive and valuable thing that comes out of this, is that, a lot of times libraries want the service providers to put their logo because they just need to know it comes from us and they don't pay attention. But if the library's name is on that gateway, I think the value of the library, I think there's a lot there for it. And the short answer is if we create enough value for the parties involved here, I think that adoption will follow.
Any other questions? Comments?
Anything on the chat? No? Great.
Nothing online. So,
Well, great. Thanks everybody for coming. I think it's been a great session. Thanks to all our presenters and thanks to all our volunteers who've been working hard to move this forward and make some progress. Thank you.
feel free to stick around for the next hour or so. I'll get some more tea and coffee and freshened up. And there are lots. Could you put your hand up if you're actually involved in